You know, there's nothing I love more than good adventure games. You know, those kind of adventure games that throw you into this new world that you have no idea what's in it, and you overcome every obstacle. And nobody pretty much did it better than Nintendo. There may be an overabundance of Mario and Zelda titles, but that's what makes them good. Every one of them seems different, even though they relatively don't change. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Though sometimes, I want to try something different. I want to try to play an adventure game that not only thrusts you into a new world, but there's more of a reason to explore it. Not something optional, but something mandatory. You have to explore everything, and you have to be under some sort of time to do it. Otherwise you can't escape or something, and... Oh, I'm playing Pikmin. I was totally describing Pikmin just a second ago, wasn't I? Why am I not surprised? Pikmin's an interesting title, actually. By many, it's considered to be one of Nintendo's last original IPs. It only got 3 games, but they're generally well received. Well, since I'm going to be playing it anyway, let me tell you a bit about it. There's not a lot to go on where Pikmin started. It started as a little side project for Nintendo with the Pikmin carrying a large creature. After deciding what direction they wanted the game to go, Nintendo decided to make the games primarily focus on the Pikmin, as well as somebody controlling them, that being Captain Olimar. The game would revolve around Captain Olimar using the Pikmin to survive on a hostile world, and the game was eventually released in North America on December 2nd, 2001. The game itself was really successful upon its release, prompting Nintendo to create Pikmin 2 in 2004. However, the Pikmin series would kinda disappear for a very long time, until Captain Olimar's guest appearance in Super Smash Bros. Brawl for the Nintendo Wii. This prompted Nintendo to bring back the Pikmin series in 2013 with Pikmin 3 for the Wii U. And shortly after Pikmin 3 was released, Olimar came back for Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U and 3DS. As usual, I will be focusing on the story, the gameplay, and the soundtrack. And just to clarify before I continue, if the game itself has an extra 4th feature or something worth noting or reviewing, I'll probably put that as my 4th thing. And for now, it's just going to be 3. And then finally, there will be spoilers in this video, so leave now if you don't want to be spoiled. Now, without further ado, let's just start. What the? That is creepy. Who did that to my computer? Forget it. It's just... I'll change it later. Let's get started on the game. Alright, I'll admit it. I walked into Pikmin not expecting too much. I expected a short and quick little game, but it's way more than that. Now, it's not a very long game, and it's not, extremely detailed or anything like that, but for the time, this game has quite a big scale, and it's a lot deeper than you might imagine. And again, not very deep, but for a rated E game directed towards children, it is surprisingly dark in its own way. Look, I'm not explaining this too well, so the game is great. Its themes are kind of surprising considering it's a kid's game, but it still turns out to be fun regardless. So let's just start with the story aspect for Pikmin. Our main protagonist, Captain Olimar, is taking a vacation through space from his planet Hakotate. As he's exploring space, his ship gets struck by a meteor. I guess it comes to show you that some people still don't check their blind spots. Olimar himself is fine, but is knocked unconscious from the blow, and his ship careens into the atmosphere of a planet below him. As his ship descends into the atmosphere, parts of it break off and scatter throughout the planet. At this point, it's a very nice setup. You have an idea of what you're going to have to do before you even start the game. Olimar wakes up a few hours later to witness his ship, the Dolphin, is broken beyond repair. However, what Olimar tells himself through his log presents a bigger problem. The air on the planet, which is known as oxygen, is poisonous to him, and that the life support system in his suit can only keep him alive for 30 days. After exploring where he crashed for a little while, he comes across this giant red thing in the middle of the grass. Needless to say, this giant red thing sprouts up and drops a seed into the ground, which Olimar himself picks up. As it turns out, that happens to be the main character of the game, a Pikmin. After deducing that the Pikmin is sentient and follows him around everywhere, Olimar multiplies the Pikmin by bringing pellets back to its home, which he dubs the Onion. Olimar also discovers that the Pikmin are like children. They're always curious about their surroundings and can do tasks that Olimar himself could not do by himself. With their help and a stroke of luck, he finds the engine to his ship, and then uses the Pikmin to bring the engine back to the ship via carrying it. This revelation brings hope to Olimar, and realizes that if he can use the Pikmin and lead them to find the other ship parts, he can escape the planet. His ship takes off and he heads into the sky, ready to go to the next area to find more ship parts. And that's essentially the story to this game. It's not really original, but it's got a certain charm to it. In fact, I think this is one of the better tutorials for the game. It's not too forced, and it's got a nice pacing to it, and it introduces what you could do with the Pikmin while you move on to the next area. Now, before I continue on to the gameplay element of this game, which is where it's going to mostly be taking place, I wanted to point out that this game has one of those kind of features. Despite Olimar saying that he needs 30 pieces to escape, the funny part is you only need 25. 5 of them are completely optional. However, if you want to see the best ending for the game, which is way more satisfying than just with 25 parts, you have to find them all, which is quite possible. Now let's focus on the gameplay for Pikmin, which is going to be pretty long. To start off on the gameplay, I should probably state that it's very important to know how the Pikmin work. The most important feature and the main way you interact with your Pikmin is to throw them with the A button. Throwing the Pikmin allows them to perform different tasks, such as attacking an enemy, picking up a ship piece or any other object, or performing simpler tasks, like building a bridge or breaking down a gate. You can call back Pikmin into your command via the B button, which causes Olimar to blow into his whistle, and any Pikmin in the surrounding circle will rush immediately to his side. The X button is a very interesting feature too. It allows you to dismiss your Pikmin into separate groups. This allows you to grab which ones you want without having to individually throw them. The Pikmin will grow dim when they do this, signifying that they are bored or not in use right now, and they will often get distracted with things surrounding them, so you have to put them in the right place when you dismiss them. When you find Olimar's radar in the second area, you can use the Y button to look at the map of the area, allowing you to find the other ship pieces. If anything, the one weird placement is the camera, which is the L button. The only way to turn the camera in this game is to push the L button, which turns the camera behind Olimar. It's a little disorienting, especially if you want to keep turning the camera in a circle. You'll have to keep pushing the L button multiple times. I suppose that's balanced out by the fact that the C stick is used to control the Pikmin in different ways. You can make them move all to the right side to avoid fire, or swarm an enemy when they're down. I should also mention that the camera is also controlled with the R and Z buttons. However, whereas the L button turns the camera behind Olimar, the R button zooms in and out of where Olimar is standing. And the Z button is used to make the camera go from a top-down position, which is very helpful in crowded areas. So overall, the controls for this game are very easy to understand. They don't make it too complicated. Although I do wish they had improved the camera a little bit. I suppose that's already simple to know. But what about the Pikmin themselves? What can I say about these creepy things? And really the only thing I find creepy about them is their eyes. Other than that though, their abilities are actually quite varied and they are used quite often. Indeed, after the first level, you will soon be introduced to the other two types of Pikmin, yellow Pikmin and blue Pikmin. Each of them do have their own abilities and have more advantages and disadvantages over the others. So it ends up being equal amongst all three, you just have to remember what they're good at. You're introduced to the red Pikmin fairly early, and you'll find out that they are often the strongest Pikmin in the game. This makes them quite handy for taking out enemies, or when you're going out to clear an area of them. They're also immune to fire, which you'll find out in the third level. This will come in handy in the future levels to come, because there's always some sort of fire-spouting volcano somewhere. Yellow Pikmin you'll find in the second level and are the lightest Pikmin in the game. Therefore, you can throw them higher than other Pikmin. And after a bit of combat, I've also determined that they are also the weakest Pikmin, so you shouldn't really be fighting with them unless you have no other choice. The main draw for the yellow Pikmin, however, is their ability to carry items called bomb rocks. Every day, a few bomb rocks will show up in specific areas. These bomb rocks have complete destructive power, which you could use to break down metal gates or throw them at groups of enemies for massive damage. But you have to be careful with the bomb rocks, because not only will they deal heavy damage to gates or enemies, but they can also kill your Pikmin in the surrounding blasts, so you have to be careful with them. You'll find blue Pikmin in the third area, and the biggest advantage they have is that they don't have trouble going through water, unlike other Pikmin. Have you heard the drowning sound of Pikmin before? Yes, it's not that pleasant. That's why I recommend going with the blue Pikmin whenever you go through water. It's pretty much the best reason for them. Despite that, it doesn't seem like they have about as many advantages as the other Pikmin do. But that's put away once you hit the fourth area, which is 75% water, so be sure to stock up on your blue Pikmin. What I like most about the game is that it makes use of all of the Pikmin's abilities. As I just explained, every one of them has their own uses, and the game remembers to use every one of them at certain points of the game. In every area, in fact, they are all useful. Granted, I do think yellow Pikmin served little purpose other than using bomb rocks later in the game, and the fact that they dedicated one area to specifically blue Pikmin is a bit annoying, but it's not a terrible distraction. When you utilize their abilities correctly, you can take on anything in this game. You can overcome every obstacle, defeat every enemy, gather every ship piece, even defeat this game's bosses. And speaking of which, I should probably mention the bosses in this game, because there are a few. The boss fights in this game aren't like traditional boss fights. There's no cutscene, there isn't a drawn-out monologue. Some of the bosses are actually just patrolling their little area, and you don't see them until they show up. And you have to utilize the Pikmin's abilities to beat those bosses, because they don't fool around. They will kill multiple Pikmin in one go if you're not careful. But the bosses themselves are also very easy to beat. They may be able to kill a lot of your Pikmin quickly, but you can also find their weaknesses quickly. For example, the beetle fires boulders at your Pikmin. He always inhales before he fires said boulder, so you probably should think to throw a Pikmin in there. And what's this? A bright red weak spot? I know what I'm throwing my Pikmin on. And then there's a simple mushroom where he can actually turn your Pikmin against you if you're not careful. I learned that the hard way, and the image was so horrifying I actually restarted that day because that was scary. And then there's a giant spider which you could throw yellow Pikmin on even though you don't really need them to fight them. And then there's this.
No, seriously, what is this?
It's tougher than the final boss in the game, and it's killing all my Pikmin. Make it stop! But regardless of what the bosses are or what they look like, they often correspond to what the game is all about, overcoming an obstacle. And they are always very big obstacles, so beating them makes you feel good about yourself, and it makes you feel like you're getting stronger. And overall, I just feel as if the game brings a lot of newer aspects to an adventure game while still sticking to tradition. It's a good mix of old and new, and it definitely makes the game better as a whole. And I might as well talk about this for a little bit before I move on to the soundtrack, but I mentioned when I was starting it that this game is a lot deeper than it appears. You'll notice that the world in this game is a mixture of beauty and horror. Maybe not horror in the traditional sense, but a lot of the things you'll find are actually creepy. I'm pretty sure that was Nintendo's intention when they were making this world, and I think they succeeded on it. Not only do you have to care about the Pikmin that are following you, you also feel as if it's in your duty to make sure that nothing bad happens to them. And if something does bad happen to them, not only do you have to replenish the ones you've lost, but you also have to carry that guilt of how they died with you. I mean, when a Pikmin gets eaten in this game, you feel bad about it, but it's almost survival of the fittest, so maybe you wouldn't treat that as badly. But the Pikmin can die in so many ways in this game. They can drown, they can get steamrolled by a boulder, burnt alive, suffocate. It's almost very frightening. You don't want to hear any of those sounds, by the way. It's not something you want to hear every night. In a way, it's pretty dark. You want to care about those Pikmin and avoid all unnecessary deaths. I suppose the worst way for a Pikmin to die in this game is to get left behind, meaning they're not in Olimar's party at the end of the day, or near the dolphin or the onions. Normally it's something very dramatic and sad. Thankfully, I tried to make that my priority and I didn't lose a single Pikmin in my playthrough, but I don't want to know what it looks like, and I'm pretty sure when you play through it, you don't want to see it either. Nintendo wasn't pulling any punches when they made this, and in a weird, sadistic way, I kind of respect them for that. Maybe I'm being a little over-sentimental or reading this a bit too deeply, but that's just what I believe. Anyways, let's move on to the final portion of the game, the soundtrack. If there's one thing I can say with absolute certainty about Pikmin's soundtrack, it's probably the fact that it is absolutely fitting. From beginning to end, I don't think there was one I necessarily hated. From something as peaceful from the impact site, to something mysterious like the distant spring. Even the boss battle themes are good. My personal favorite is still the menu theme, which you hear before you choose a level. But overall, I think Pikmin's soundtrack is really nice. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, and I personally think that's a huge plus. How expansive this world is and how you're supposed to feel like you're in this game's world. All in all, it's very memorable, and I think that's the best thing when it comes to a soundtrack.
So overall, the game itself is not that difficult. There are some moments where it gets a little bit more tricky, but it's not that hard. I guess the game... I'll go get it. Miyamoto sure doesn't know when to stop. As I was saying though, the game itself is actually quite short. It's about 5 to 6 hours long. Each day in the game is about 15 minutes, so it actually builds up as you go along. You can actually beat this game on your first try if you have an idea about what you're doing. I managed to do it myself. I got all 30 parts in only 25 days. It's cutting it close a little bit, but I'm really proud of it. It's really nice, and oh, that's disappointing. So, now that that's done, let's go review and see what's good and bad about Pikmin. Second thought, let me change this first. I'll be right there. Pikmin might come off to some as being a little too different from what Nintendo usually makes. Honestly, I think that's the game's greatest strength. It takes something different from the normal Nintendo titles and goes into uncharted waters, so to speak. It's got enough creativity to get you playing and keep you playing, which I think is the most important part. It was quite enjoyable to play, and there were certainly a lot of good things to say about it. So let's start with the good. To start, I'll say that the levels themselves were varied and atmospheric. Granted, amongst all the levels, you'll only be visiting 3 more often than not. However, they all serve a good purpose. Their puzzles are very nice and they all have their own secrets, which encourages exploration. Despite being a different turn from a Mario or a Zelda game, I'm glad to see Nintendo remember that the enemy variety in their games is a very important feature. Granted, the only way to kill some of these enemies is to throw Pikmin on them, but some of them require more intricate ways of dealing with them. It could be something simple like throwing a Pikmin on a certain part of their body, using a bomb rock to soften them up, or just steamrolling entire groups all over them. They aren't very difficult to beat, but there's something extremely satisfying about overcoming them. The next thing I'd like to point out is probably my favorite part about Pikmin. Its soundtrack is extremely fitting. When a soundtrack accompanies a level really well, it sets the standard for that level. The songs in this game almost seem to tell some sort of story. They are beautifully composed and almost make me want to play it again. Another thing I'm really glad they did well is how easy it is to use the Pikmin. The controls are very nice, they're easy to understand, but a little bit trickier to master along the way. And finally, this game actually has some pretty rewarding boss fights. It goes back to what I said about the enemy variety. There isn't too many bosses in this game. In fact, I think there's only 8, and 2 of them are optional. Ultimately, it comes down to a normal Nintendo fashion of throw as many Pikmin on its weak spot as you possibly can. However, you have to find that weakness first. Now, despite how much I like the game, there are a few problems about Pikmin. Nothing too serious, but something still worth noting. So, here are the bad things. I'll start by saying that the camera is unfortunately frustrating. It's a kind of funny how all the games I've been playing recently have a very bad camera, and nothing is more apparent than all of the GameCube ones. Though with Pikmin it's a little bit more irritating than that. The use of the L button on the GameCube controller to control the camera's direction is a little awkward. You can also hit the Z button to get an over-the-top view, which is a little bit more manageable, and the right button just zooms in and out. You're going to be mostly zoomed out half the game, so you could say you could avoid all these frustrating camera issues. But it still boils down to if you want to turn the camera, it's with the L stick, which is a little disorienting. I suppose it's a necessary sacrifice because the use of the C stick, which is normally the camera in GameCube games, is used to control your Pikmin. This next problem I have might come off as a little personal, but I think the game is a little bit too easy. If you take all of the enemies and the puzzles and even the levels themselves and try to beat it on your first try, you might not have that much of a problem. To some, that might not be a bad thing. I just wish there was a bit more challenge into the game. Heck, even the last level itself, called the Final Trial, you'd expect something mildly challenging, right? But it isn't. All you have to do is remember what your Pikmin are made for and let them do their work. I think the only time this game gets even remotely difficult is when you're fighting bosses. Point is, a little bit more challenge might have been a very good thing. But again, this is probably personal. And the final thing I have is also personal. This game doesn't have a lot of replayability. And before you say anything, yes, I know that's subjective. But to me, I really like this world. I like what it represents. I like how it feels. I would love to go back to this game every now and then and play through it. But the point I'm getting at is this game doesn't change anything. It's the same thing on every playthrough. Same placements of enemies, same placements on pieces, same boss fights. And I suppose in the long run you could probably ignore this. Again, it's subjective. I really wish there was a bit of change between every playthrough so it wouldn't feel the same. However, that doesn't entirely ruin the game. I just wish there was a bit more to it. Despite all of that, I thought Pikmin was truly an enjoyable game. It honestly kind of surprises me that there's only 3 games in the series. Now, I know it's not going to ever be as popular as Mario or Zelda or Pokemon or anything like that, but I'm honestly a little disappointed that it doesn't get as much love as it should. Although I guess I shouldn't be complaining entirely. I mean, at least they're in Smash Brothers. But if you take what this game gives you and look at it from a nice perspective, it's definitely a nice change of pace from other Nintendo titles, and it's definitely worth picking up and playing. But overall, I had a lot of fun playing Pikmin. Despite its flaws, it completely was outweighed by all the good things. It was enjoying to see what Nintendo could do outside the Mario and Zelda universe, and I'm glad to see this game get some love and attention. Despite how small the game might be, and quite frankly its characters, I mean, almost the size of a quarter and the Pikmin are even smaller than that, I thought the game itself brought a lot of heart. That's why I'm proud to give Pikmin a 9 out of 10. It is worth picking up if you have a GameCube or a Wii, and you'll enjoy what the world gives to you. In fact, I think the whole series is probably worth picking up. Granted, I never played Pikmin 3, so it's kind of subjective when I say that, but somewhere down the line I plan on picking that up. So as for the next 3 games, I thought it was kind of silly putting up Half-Life 2 last time, considering that, well, everybody knows it's already popular, but it got me thinking. There were a lot of PC games before Half-Life 2 that I probably could have put there instead. And at the moment I don't have a lot of console game ideas, but I will probably do in maybe a week or 2. So for this last voting session, because after this it would be Luigi's choice, I don't think I explained that well at all last time, it's going to be 3 PC games. The catch is though, that these PC games have to come before the year 2000. So out of these 3 PC games, which one should I review? Should I review Out of This World, Baldur's Gate, or... because a friend of mine suggested it, and why not? It's before 2000, even if it's extremely childish. I'm good with kids, I make them laugh all the time. They must laugh at my nose. Putt-Putt joins the parade. I can't even finish saying that without laughing. So once again, I'm a Luigi, and this has been a Luigi review. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some morning to do, so I'll see you guys later. Yoshi.
Yoshi! Green cat!
I let them all down. 432 Pikmin will not see the end of the game.
Wow! Green cat!
Not seriously enough if those ones died.
Yoshi! Yoshi!
I know. I know.